the first stage of compilation, the first Islamic century. Now, after the demise of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so as he was no more alive, so it means they had no other primary source. When Prophet he was alive, he was the primary source, and then after him, only the Quran was the primary source. The revelations had ended. Secondly, ahadith, they had explanation of the Quran, disputes were solved in the ahadith of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, legal guidance, guidance about social life. All these details, they were in the ahadith of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's why they were important. You may take the example after the demise of Prophet and the companions, or maybe they had an issue where Prophet should be buried. So the first hadith which was narrated after the demise of Prophet ﷺ, that was by Hazrat Abu Bakr radhiyallahu ta'ala anhu. He narrated that I listened from Prophet ﷺ that no prophet dies except that he is buried where he dies. So this hadith solved a great issue, a problem. So you can see the value or role of hadith, that how problems they were sought out by hadith of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, why hadith narration increased in the first century? Why people, they took a lot of interest in narrating ahadith, learning ahadith, and so much focus was on ahadith of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What were the reasons? The first reason was that companions of Prophet they were passing away gradually, and each companion, he had his memory, and he had maybe writings of Prophet sallallahu ahadith. So that's why that was a great loss for Tabain. So that's why an urgency was felt that ahadith should be preserved before all of these Sahaba they pass away. So that's why Tabain, they thought that ahadith of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they should be preserved and they should be protected. Secondly, new converts, they needed guidance in worship and daily life. So that's why they took a lot of interest in learning ahadith of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So hadith teaching demand that increased. Now the new converted Muslims, many of them, they had just listened about Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So they wanted to learn more and more about Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They had just listened that he was a messenger of Allah, history just in a short time, and his role model and his model of excellence, but they had not seen. So naturally they were more enthusiastic about learning more and more about Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that's why hadith demand that increase. Furthermore, legal issues, because of expansion, governance that needed guidance from hadith, taxation issues, or many other issues which were more related to administration, maybe the warfare, family law, inheritance. All of these things, they are explained in ahadith of Prophet ﷺ. That's why hadith demand increased. Furthermore, geographical spread of the companions, as we see most importantly in the time of Hazrat Usman radhiyallahu ta'ala anhu. We discussed in the last class that he allowed Sahaba Ikram to settle down in other territories, Syria, Egypt, Persia, Iraq. So Sahaba Ikram, they spread over there, they settled down over there, and with the spread of Sahaba, hadith knowledge also spread, and different centers of learning, they emerged around Sahaba Ikram. So now when Tabain, they had to learn about hadith, they had to travel. Maybe if they want to learn about learn all hadith from Hazrat Abu Huraira, they had to travel to Yemen. They want to learn hadith from Abdullah ibn Masud, they had to travel to Kufa, Iraq. In the same way, if they had to learn anything from Amr ibn al-As, they need to travel to Egypt, or maybe Syria, or in other parts of the Khilafah. So it became hectic or difficult for Tabain, that they have to travel a lot for collecting ahadith from different Sahaba Ikram, because Sahaba, they spread in the Islamic Khilafah. That's why Tabain, they thought that they should travel and they should write down ahadith from different Sahaba, one after another, and in that way, they started making chapters of these books according to the names of Sahaba Ikram. That's why we see the early hadith books, most of them, they are Musnad books. Musnad are those books which are according to the narrators. Chapters are according to the narrators. Maybe at that time, Tabain, they went to Hazrat Abu Huraira, Any tabi'i went to Abu Huraira, and he compiled all ahadith from Abu Huraira radhiyallahu anhu, and he made the whole chapter ahadith of Abu Huraira. Then he went to Abdullah ibn Masud, then he made the second chapter. Then he went to other Sahaba Ikram, then made more chapters. So in that way, we see early ahadith books, they were mostly mustad books. Thematically, ahadith, they were not separated. So that's the development we see in the era of Tabain, the first Islamic century. Another important reason of Hadith collection, that was fear of fabrication and error. Now, scholars, they were more careful, and they were systematically analyzing and evaluating ahadith of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And because of these reasons, some of the people, most importantly, Jews, Sabbaites, Abdullah bin Sabah's followers, and Persians, even some of them, they were making fake ahadith to create divisions among the Muslims, or maybe for other reasons as well that we'll discuss in detail as well. So, because of these reasons, Sahaba Ikram and Tabain, most importantly Tabain, they compiled hadith from Sahaba Ikram. And a question you might see in past papers, that why was it considered by Tabain, or maybe after the time of Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, why was it considered more important that hadith of Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam should be preserved? A 10 marks question is seen in past paper. You can see, maybe that is recently, maybe 2-3 years back. Now, nature of hadith activity. In the first century, in first Islamic century, ahadith, they were collected, they were memorized, ahadith teachings, they were promoted. Ahadith were taught in hadith circle to tabain to taba tabain. Ahadith were transmitted from Sahaba to tabain to taba tabain, and verified as well. Tabain, they verified ahadith from Sahaba Ikram. So in that way, all these things were seen in first Islamic century. But large formal books, they were not made during this time. Those Tabain, they just made their own booklets, their own compilations, but they did not systematically publish like a book form. They didn't publish. They used personally, or they taught from these scriptures to their students, and they compiled, and they made their own notes and scriptures in that way. So publicly they were not printed, but they were printed in a way that only given to those who met that tabai, or those who were students of these tabain. So in that way, ahadith, they were transmitted. But on a large account, or maybe by state action, or maybe under the state supervision, ahadith books, they were not preserved, compiled during the first Islamic century. That happened in the second Islamic century, during the time of Umar bin Abdul Aziz, that we'll study in the second Islamic century. Now, Sahaba Ikram, they were very cautious about narrating the ahadith, because it was a religious responsibility, and they were very careful about fake attribution of hadith, because it's a grave sin. A hadith is mentioned that the one who narrated any fake hadith, his abode will be in the hellfire. That's why we see that Hazrat Abu Bakr, Hazrat Umar, many important Sahaba, they related less ahadith, or maybe they were busy in administrative tasks, so they could not arrange circles, hadith circles in that way. Their duties or their tasks, they were different. They were having administrative tasks, but other Sahaba like Hazrat Abu Hurairah, Anas ibn Malik, and other Sahaba, they devoted their lives for hadith transmission. We see that whenever any hadith was narrated in front of Hazrat Umar, then he used to ask for the witness of that narration. So in that way, a chain of narration started to be built from that time of Sahaba Ikram. So Isnad criticism we find in later centuries, that started from the time of Sahaba Ikram. Top narrators, you can see their hadith: Abu Huraira radhiyallahu anhu, 5,374, Abdullah ibn Umar, more than 2,000, Anas ibn Malik, more than 2,000, Hazrat Aisha, 2,210. And in that way, you can see the sequence that these are Sahaba Ikram who narrated more ahadith, or more ahadith, they were recorded from them. Maybe it is possible that Sahaba narrated ahadith, but they were not recorded. But these are those Sahaba, or this is a number of ahadith which were recorded from these Sahaba Ikram by their students. Most importantly, we see that during this first Islamic century. The work was done by Tabaeen. They recorded ahadith from Sahaba Ikram. A few important works, Sahifa Sadika. It was done by Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As. Amr ibn al-As we discussed earlier. He was the arbitrator from Hazrat Muawiyah's side, and we discussed about him previously. So he was his son, Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As. Some people they mention Abdullah ibn Umar. So this is a mistake. Sahifa Sadika was not done by Abdullah ibn Umar, but it was Abdullah ibn Amr. Okay, 10,000 ahadith or around that, and it was preserved within his family, and later it was added in the big book Musnad Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal. Musnad Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal is an important book of the third Islamic century. Sahifa Sahiha, Hammam ibn Munabbi. Hammam ibn Munabbi was a student of Hazrat Abu Huraira, Razila Talanu, and today we see that it is a most ancient hadith book, oldest hadith book, which is still preserved. So Sahifa Hammam ibn Murabbi, it was also lost, but recently, maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago, Dr. Hamidullah, he was a research scholar. He did a lot of research, deep research, and he found out his copies from ancient libraries, handwritten copies, and then he published it again. So now we found that the most or the oldest hadith book which is still preserved, that is Sahifa Sahiha, and it is from Hammam ibn Murabbi. Now, all these ahadiths they are also included in Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim later on in the third Islamic century. Bashir ibn Nahik was also one of the students of Abu Huraira. You can see the details. Musnad Abu Huraira, that was also a hadith book from Abu Huraira. It was in his family, and then it was with Abdul Aziz ibn Marwan. And in that way, later it was added in the huge books of hadith, Musnad Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal and other. Sahifa Hazrat Ali Raziyallahu that I mentioned earlier, in that things related to zakat and other things were mentioned. On Khutbah al-Wida and Islamic rulings, they were also included in that. Sahifa Jabir and many other examples are seen over here, that ahadith of Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, they were recorded in the first Islamic century. Writings of Imam Nafi, they are also important. Imam Nafi was the student of Abdullah ibn Umar. We will discuss about him further in that when we'll discuss about Muwatta Imam Malik. So Imam Nafi is also very important hadith narrator from Tabain. He was the student of Abdullah ibn Umar. That we'll discuss further. Abdullah ibn Masud and Urwa ibn Zubair is also very important. He was a nephew of Hazrat Aisha radhiyallahu anha, and many of the ahadith were recorded from Hazrat Aisha radhiyallahu anha by Urwa ibn Zubair. And he was also one of the student teacher of Zuhri, that we'll discuss further. And many other examples are here. I'm not going in much detail because we have short time. So during this time period, ahadith of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they were recorded by Tabain from Sahaba Ikram. I hope this topic is clear. Now we are moving forward to the second stage of compilation.